There was a time when Sunday felt different from every other day. The streets were quieter, the hours moved more slowly, and families seemed to gather almost instinctively. Yet somewhere along the way, that rhythm faded, so gradually that many of us barely noticed it happening. Hello, I'm Norman Carter, and this is my channel. Welcome, and thank you for being here. On many quiet Sunday mornings decades ago, a neighborhood often woke differently than it did during the rest of the week. The air itself seemed calmer, as if the day had been granted a slower pace. Curtains opened a little later, radios played softly in kitchens, and the familiar sounds of daily work were noticeably absent. Lawnmowers rested in garages, storefront shutters stayed closed, and the streets felt unusually open and peaceful. Many of us remember how the day seemed to unfold almost gently, without the sense of urgency that shaped the other 6 days of the week. Sunday had a rhythm of its own. It was not simply a day off. It was something quieter, more deliberate, though few people at the time tried to explain exactly why. In those days, the week itself carried a clear structure. Monday began the practical responsibilities of life. By Wednesday, routines had settled into their familiar patterns. Friday evenings signaled relief and anticipation. But Sunday was different. It was not simply the end of the week. In many homes, it felt almost like a pause in time. A Sunday morning often began with small, familiar rituals. In kitchens across countless neighborhoods, coffee brewed slowly while sunlight filtered through the windows. Newspapers were unfolded across the table, their pages filled with the week's events, local stories, and quiet advertisements for furniture stores or family-run businesses. Children moved more slowly than usual, still wrapped in the comfort of a day that did not demand much from them. The streets reflected that calm. Fewer cars passed by. The constant movement that defined weekdays was noticeably reduced. If someone stepped outside their home, they might hear birds more clearly than traffic. Occasionally, a neighbor walked by, offering a quiet greeting or a brief conversation over a front fence. It seemed natural then, almost automatic. But in retrospect, it reveals something subtle about the way life was organized. At the time, few people questioned it. Many families shared some version of a Sunday routine. For some, the morning began with a visit to a local church. For others, it simply meant dressing a little more carefully than usual and gathering for breakfast together. In countless homes across the United States, Europe, and many other places, the dining table played a quiet but central role in how the day unfolded. Meals were rarely rushed. A breakfast might stretch longer than usual, with conversation moving slowly from one topic to another. The week's small events were discussed. School activities, work stories, neighborhood news. It was not dramatic conversation. In fact, it was often quite ordinary. Yet, that ordinary exchange carried something important. It allowed time to listen, time to reflect, time simply to be present with one another. Over the years, researchers studying family life in the mid-20th century often noticed how shared meals functioned as an anchor for daily routines. In 1965, for example, a study in the United States found that the average family spent significantly more time eating together than later generations would. Sunday meals, in particular, were often longer and more deliberate. Yet at the time, it rarely felt like a tradition that needed protecting. It was simply the way life unfolded. Outside, neighborhoods carried the same quiet rhythm. Children played in yards or along sidewalks, often with a little more freedom than they experienced during school days. The pace of play was unhurried. A group might gather around a bicycle, a ball, or a simple game invented on the spot. Hours could pass without anyone feeling the need to check the time. Adults often spent the afternoon in small, familiar activities. Some repaired something around the house. Others tended a garden or sat on a porch with a book. Occasionally, neighbors visited each other, not through carefully planned invitations, but through simple proximity. A walk down the street might turn into an unexpected conversation that lasted half an hour. These moments were rarely considered remarkable, yet they quietly shaped how people experienced community. At the time, many neighborhoods functioned as small social ecosystems. People knew the families living a few houses away. They recognized familiar faces at local stores. Conversations unfolded naturally in shared spaces, on sidewalks, near mailboxes, or outside corner shops. Sunday seemed to strengthen those small connections. Without the noise of work schedules and constant errands, people were simply more available to each other. But this rhythm did not exist by accident. In the mid-20th century, many societies still maintain informal agreements about how Sunday should feel. Businesses often remain closed. Work emails, of course, did not exist. The idea of shopping late into the evening would have seemed unusual in many places. This quiet pause created a subtle boundary in time. It separated the practical demands of life from a day meant, at least in part, for rest and reflection. At the time, few people described it in philosophical terms, yet it carried a quiet influence over daily life. Children grew up sensing that Sunday belonged to a different atmosphere. The pace of conversation was slower. The expectations were lighter. Even the tone of the day seemed softer. Looking back, many people recall small details that captured this feeling. The sound of distant church bells, the smell of a slow-cooked meal filling the house, the quiet afternoon sunlight stretching across a living room carpet. None of these details seemed important individually, yet together they formed something recognizable, a shared cultural rhythm. But subtle changes were already beginning. In the late 1960s and 1970s, social patterns across many countries began to shift. Work schedules expanded. Retail businesses gradually extended their hours. Technology introduced new forms of entertainment that filled time more densely. At first, the changes appeared small. A store opened on Sunday afternoon. A television program drew families into separate rooms. Weekend errands began to replace long, uninterrupted afternoons. Few people considered these changes significant. In fact, many welcomed them. Convenience often feels like progress, especially when it arrives quietly. Yet over time, something subtle began to change in how Sundays were experienced. The quiet pause in the week became less visible. The day itself did not disappear, of course. Sunday still existed on calendars, just as it always had. But its atmosphere began to shift in ways that were difficult to measure. At first, almost no one noticed. Only later did many begin to sense that the day had slowly lost something that had once shaped the rhythm of family life, neighborhood connections, and the simple experience of time itself. And the most curious part of the story is that the transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, across decades, through small adjustments that seem harmless in isolation. But when viewed together, they reveal a quiet question that many people today still find themselves asking. How did a day once defined by calm, connection, and shared routine slowly become just another extension of the week? And perhaps more importantly, when exactly did that change begin? In the early years of that transition, the shift was so subtle that it blended almost invisibly into everyday life. A grocery store might begin opening its doors for a few hours on Sunday afternoon. At first, the change felt convenient rather than significant. If someone had forgotten an ingredient for dinner or needed something small for the house, the solution was suddenly available. Few people saw this as the beginning of a broader transformation. Yet routines often change not through dramatic events, but through the accumulation of small adjustments. As the years passed, more businesses followed the same pattern. What had once been an exception slowly became normal. By the late 20th century, in many cities, Sunday shopping was no longer unusual. Malls filled with families browsing stores, restaurants became busier, and the quiet stillness that had once defined the day gradually softened into something more active. At the same time, technology began to reshape how people experienced time at home. Television had already been present in many living rooms by the 1950s, but its role expanded steadily over the decades. Sunday afternoons that had once been spent outdoors or visiting neighbors increasingly centered around scheduled programs, sports broadcasts, or movies. Families often still gathered in the same room, but the focus of attention shifted toward a glowing screen. Again, at the time, this seemed harmless. In fact, it felt entertaining, modern, and even unifying. Millions of people across the country could watch the same broadcast simultaneously, sharing a cultural moment that connected distant households. But something subtle changed in the texture of the day. Conversations became quieter when the television was on. Outdoor play gradually competed with indoor entertainment. The unstructured hours that had once stretched across the afternoon slowly filled with planned activities or scheduled programs. Time itself began to feel more organized. Later still, the digital era accelerated this process in ways earlier generations could hardly have imagined. Personal computers entered homes. Cable television expanded entertainment options. Eventually, smartphones placed endless streams of information and distraction directly into people's hands. The boundaries between days began to blur. Emails arrived regardless of the day of the week. Online shopping removed the need to wait for stores to open. Work responsibilities could follow people home through laptops and mobile devices. The quiet pause that had once defined Sunday became increasingly difficult to maintain. Yet the change did not arrive with a sense of loss. For many years, it simply felt like progress. Modern life offered greater flexibility, greater convenience, and a wider range of choices. Families could plan activities that fit their schedules rather than being constrained by limited business hours. Entertainment became more accessible than ever before. Information moved instantly across continents. In many ways, life expanded. And yet, over time, a curious observation began to appear in conversations among older generations. Many people who had lived through both eras started to notice a difference that was difficult to describe precisely. It was not necessarily about nostalgia. It was about rhythm. The structure of the week had once included a natural pause, a day that felt separate from the rest. That pause had created space for reflection, for conversation, for moments that were not driven by productivity or urgency. When that pause faded, the week began to feel continuous. Monday flowed into Tuesday, Wednesday into Thursday, and before long Sunday felt almost indistinguishable from the surrounding days. The calendar still labeled it differently, but the experience of the day had quietly changed. Some sociologists studying time use in the late 20th and early 21st centuries noticed similar patterns. Surveys showed that although people technically had more leisure options than previous generations, many also reported feeling more rushed. This observation puzzled researchers. How could society with greater convenience and more labor-saving technology feel as though time itself had become scarce? Part of the answer may lie in the disappearance of natural boundaries. When every day becomes equally busy, equally connected, and equally accessible to work or entertainment, the mind rarely experiences a true pause. Without noticing it, people begin carrying the same mental pace through all 7 days of the week. In earlier decades, Sunday quietly interrupted that pace. It reminded people that life was not only about activity, but also about stillness. The reminder was rarely spoken aloud. It existed simply through shared behavior. Closed storefronts signaled that errands could wait. Quiet streets suggested that the day belonged to families and neighborhoods. Long meals and slow afternoons offered space for conversations that might never happen during busier hours. None of these elements were dramatic, yet together they created something that modern schedules rarely reproduce. Even today, many older individuals can recall the distinctive feeling of those Sundays with surprising clarity. They remember the sound of distant laughter drifting across a backyard, the rhythm of a porch swing moving slowly in the afternoon breeze, or the sense that the entire neighborhood seemed to breathe more slowly for a few hours. Memory has a way of preserving those small impressions. They linger not because they were extraordinary, but because they form part of life's quiet structure. And yet the story of Sundays is not entirely about disappearance. In many places, traces of that earlier rhythm still survive. Some families continue gathering for shared meals. Certain neighborhoods still grow quiet on Sunday mornings. Parks filled with walkers, children, and couples enjoying the slower pace of the day. These moments may be less universal than they once were, but they have not vanished entirely. Perhaps that is why the question continues to appear from time to time in conversations, articles, and reflections about modern life. What happened to Sundays? The question is not always literal. It is often a way of asking something deeper about time itself. How did the rhythm of our weeks become so full that even the quietest day began to resemble the busiest ones? And why do memories of those slower Sundays still feel so vivid, even decades later? The answer may not lie in any single change, no single invention, no single policy, no single cultural shift. Instead, It appears to be the result of many small adjustments that gradually reshape how people organize their lives. Each adjustment seemed reasonable. Each change brought its own advantages. But together, over the course of several generations, they altered the atmosphere of one particular day. The interesting part is that time itself has not changed. The week still contains the same 7 days it always did. The sun still rises on Sunday morning just as it did 50 or 60 years ago. Streets, houses, and neighborhoods remain where they have always been, yet the feeling of the day has evolved. And perhaps that is what makes the memory of those earlier Sundays so powerful. They remind us that the experience of time is shaped not only by clocks and calendars, but also by the rhythms people choose to create within their lives. For many years, Sunday quietly held a special place in that rhythm, not through rules or strict expectations, but through shared habits that slowed the pace of the week. Today, that slower rhythm appears less often. But from time to time, when a neighborhood falls quiet in the afternoon, or when a family lingers around a table without watching the clock, something familiar seems to return, if only for a moment. A reminder that time once moved differently, and perhaps in small ways it still can.